Invite up our darshan for this morning, Donald Kane.
Shabbat Shalom. Last year, someone who I've known for several decades surprised me by asserting that he believes in divine beings, such as angels, pointing to the inerrancy of the Bible as his source of belief. All right, this one's on, right? Okay. His profession of faith prompted me to focus specifically on what the Tanakh has to say about angels and other of God's unusual creatures. And what I encountered was sometimes extraordinary, difficult pictures our Bible paints of God, his creations, and the way God works. These portrayals are certainly not those that Renaissance and Baroque painters imagined, ones of chubby, winged infants, cherubs flying around God, trumpeting his holiness. Instead, they illustrate a Bible full of monsters. And these pictures, they're not hidden. I mean, they're in plain sight. I found them on the printed pages of the Tanakh. Uncanny creatures lurking in every direction. From the hybrid monsters surrounding God to the stunning array of peculiar beings touching down on earth, and from giants living in the land of milk and honey to Leviathan swimming beneath its seas. The stories of these creatures, described over the many centuries it took to complete our canon, are horrifying and really more suitable for Grimm's fairy tales than uplifting scripture. For example, those cute cherubs, they're not cute at all. They are, in fact, some of the deadliest shapeshifters in a biblical universe teeming with bizarre figures. So, what's a monster? Well, when it comes to the Bible, these monsters found within the 24 books don't have a single defining physical trait because they come in all shapes and sizes. Nevertheless, they do share a few commonalities. For one thing, they tend to be giant-sized. Many seem to have superhuman or supernatural strengths or powers, and one of the more common traits found in biblical narratives is that of physical hybridity, the mixture of two or more species. The biblical presentations of these monsters demonstrate that God's nature isn't always portrayed as benevolent. In fact, they illustrate that at times, God could be viewed as the monster of monsters. To demonstrate this aspect of God, let's do a brief review of some of those incredible stories written in the Tanakh. It is God, in this terrifying guise, who once destroyed the living world, except for Noah and those loaded on his ark. And it was by his hand that Sodom and Gomorrah were decimated. Firstborn Egyptian children were summarily eliminated by God's command. Despite God's promise to remove sickness from the midst of the Israelites in Exodus, in Numbers, an angry God visited a plague upon the Israelites, fleeing the Pharaoh because they complained about their food. The apostasy of the golden calf also angered God, so he enjoined the Levites to take their swords and kill everyone, even their brothers, friends, and neighbors. 3,000 Israelites died in this recounting. And just a few verses later in Exodus, still wanting vengeance, God visited another plague on the remaining Israelites. According to 2 Kings, the Assyrian army of 185,000 surrounding Jerusalem in the time of King Hezekiah was struck down on his orders. God directed King Saul to wipe out the Amalekites. In Exodus, God verged on killing Moses, but was stopped only when Moses' wife, Zipporah, intervened. Just prior to the Babylonian exile, Jeremiah quoted a still wrathful God, quote, In this place, I will ruin the plans of Judah and Jerusalem. I will make them fall by the sword before their enemies at the hands of those who want to kill them, and I will give their carcasses to the food and the wild animals. I will make them eat the flesh of their sons and daughters, and they will eat one another's flesh, and so forth. The most dangerous of the biblical monsters we encounter in the Bible seem to be in God's employ. They are his entourage, God's army, if you will. Members of this entourage include the seraphim, fire-breathing creatures called upon by God to scare people into obedience. The seraphim described by Isaiah are beings with 6 wings which fly around the throat of God, crying in very loud voices, "Holy, holy, holy." In the book of Numbers, God deploys these fiery, biting seraphim against Israel, only then to turn around and offer these same suffering Israelites his protection from those same seraphim, holding out the promise of healing their deadly wounds. Despite this offer, in Isaiah's famous throne vision, seraphim ominously herald God's decision not to heal the people, but instead to facilitate their destruction. Then there are the aforementioned cherubim, who again are definitely not innocent infant-like angels. In fact, cherubim are among the bizarre creatures described by the prophet Ezekiel, each as having, quote, 4 faces and 4 wings, their bodies full of eyes with adjacent high wheels. And Ezekiel later described the cherubim as frightening hybrids of dangerous creatures such as eagles, lions, bulls, and even adult humans. So we really should not be tempted to regard angels as simply God's innocent messengers, because they fulfill God's deadly assignments as well. Among those duties is that of mass destruction, a job given to an angel known as the destroyer. The destroying angel is called Malek HaMashit and is found in the book of Job, as well as in other biblical books such as Proverbs. We first meet this destroyer as the angel of death who snuffed out the lives of Egyptian firstborns in Exodus, and in 2 Kings, this is the angel said to have devastated the Assyrian army on God's command. It was the destroying angel that blocked Balaam and his donkey and threatened to kill Balaam, as related in the Parsha traditionally read today. When King David undertook a census contrary to God's instruction, punishment was meted out by the destroyer in the form of a plague that killed 70,000 Israelites from Dan to Beersheba. One more celestial being to note is the adversary. The adversary is also called Ha-Satan, and first appears in the introduction to the book of Job as a participant in the divine council. This creature was a full-on sadistic spirit who robbed Job of his wealth, killed his entire family, and then afflicted Job with painful boils all over his body. Now, God knew that Job was an innocent man and a devout believer. Nevertheless, God gave Ha-Satan free rein to inflict all these traumas, and then he stood by and watched. After Job's travails, God restored Job's wealth and granted him a replacement family. Too bad for the one that God had sanctioned for destruction. When angels show up in biblical narratives, it frequently portends bad news for humans. Biblical characters sometimes recognize angels for what they are and know full well the lethal danger they pose. Genesis describes Jacob wrestling with an angel, and the prophet Hosea claimed that this angel maimed Jacob as a punishment from God. Why are there demons in God's ranks as we meet them in Judges, 1 Kings, and 1 Samuel? Well, consider the recurring message in the Tanakh that God is one who takes vengeance. Do we remember the demonic spirit sent to torment King Saul because Saul disobeyed God's instructions? There are also giants present in the Bible, including violent, semi-divine creatures living on earth. One explanation for their origin is that they are the product of sexual relations between some of God's angels and the daughters of man. And we know these giants from Genesis and Numbers as the Nephilim. Another group of giants were the semi-divine Raphaim, whom our ancestors may have believed were once denizens of Sheol, the predominant Hebrew term for a post-mortem underworld. Memorialized in 5 books of the Bible, they fought against the Canaanites and the Israelites. And among the last of the Rephaim was King Og, whose enormous iron bed measured 13 and a half feet long by 6 foot wide, so fit for a giant. Not all of God's monsters inhabit a celestial or earthly terrain. We encounter sea monsters in the Bible, notably Leviathan, which Isaiah described as a slippery, twisty serpent. For many ancient Levantine cultures, Leviathan was both master of the sea and the embodiment of the primordial chaos that the sea represented. Our Bible inherited and transformed this fire-breathing sea monster and depicted it as a creature threatening to eat the damned when their lives were over. While Leviathan is at one point God's enemy, God seems once to have had a special affection for Leviathan. Consider the words of Psalm 104, which tells us that God created Leviathan to play with. So it seems God needed Leviathan as a dreadful playmate. These stories seem to show that, at times, God demonstrates a malevolent attitude toward at least some of his human creations. So is God depicted as caring more about his children in the afterlife than he did when they were living? Not really. In the Tanakh, God's main attitude toward the dead seems to be apathy. Biblical characters fear Sheol, in part because it means being permanently separated from God. Second, Isaiah warns, quote, "For the grave cannot praise you. Death cannot sing your praise. Those who go down to Sheol cannot hope for your faithfulness." Thus, the Bible appears to demonstrate that once humans have departed this life and can no longer honor God or follow heavenly commands, God abandons them entirely. The Tanakh sends a clear message here. We are all expendable and replaceable. Now, thus far, we have reviewed a complex picture of a very complex God, whom the Bible champions as very good, but at times we now see is perplexingly also portrayed as very bad. The biblical representation of God does appear to do bad things, notably through his monsters, where every single type of divine being shown acting in God's service in the Bible injures, threatens, tortures, or kills in his command. So there is good reason to fear this aspect of God, the aspect responsible for the monstrous acts as portrayed in the Tanakh. Nevertheless, God is also pictured as wonderful when the Bible highlights God's goodness by describing his love, mercy, and faithfulness, powerful passages that uplift the weary and sustain the desolate, that bring a sense of hope and peace to the devastated. Both of these incarnations are present in our Bible. Do we only embrace the demonstrations of God's love and mercy and set aside the monstrous tales that record God doing violent and twisted things, the passages that pull back the curtain and reveal an aspect of God as monster? Well, perhaps the answer to this predicament is to embrace the rich diversity of perspectives within the Bible. After all, the Tanakh is a compilation of many authors with diverse perspectives from different locales and different centuries. When we read and contemplate the more troubling depictions of God and God's entourage, we encounter a vital dimension to this diverse anthology, as the many biblical writers attempted in their times to grapple with the messiness of their world and God's place in it. How poignant is it that at least some of the Bible's ancient writers didn't pretend that everything would be just fine if people would only trust God? They warned us. Even the prophets warned us. They knew that sometimes God is why things aren't fine at all. This recognition makes the Bible all the richer and more powerful. It gives the Bible its depth and dimension. And when all is said and done, we recognize the Bible isn't a solution to the struggles of life, but is a reflection of them. Shabbat Shalom.